Names can be a good starting point to learn to write clean code. Why? Because we can't imagine writing a program without naming something. We name our variables, functions, arguments, classes, packages, modules, source files, directories, configuration files, deployment files, archive files, etc. We name almost everything in computer programming. Because naming something is so crucial and we do it all the time, good names are needed, not only for better readability and understandability of your software, but for performance related aspects as well. So when we cannot escape from naming process, we must learn to do it well. Some people consider naming things in program as similar to naming things in life. But naming things in real life and naming entities in a program are not the same thing. Things in real life can have names with no logical reason behind it. For example, when people ask your name and you tell XYZ, then nobody will ask back to you why you have been called with such a name, at least if the name is not that awkward. Because names form only a tiny part of your huge live identity. That's why they say that what's in a name. But that's not the case with the computer program. Things in a program should be named in a way that their names should reflect what they stand for because their names are their identity. There is no other way to identify a variable, a function, or a class other than its name. Your compiler, your memory, your entire system behind identifies it with its name. Some people take naming parts so casually and they argue that they prefer focusing more on the logical part and other necessary things than spending too much time thinking about an irrelevant thing like name. When it comes to naming things, they simply put whatever character or word is coming to their mind at that moment, say 1, 2, 3 or ABC or XYZ. Well, they're not wrong, but they often end up developing a program that no one can understand. And no matter how well intentioned they are, those intentions does not reflect in their code. So there are certain time tested approaches that can help us in creating good and useful names. And it's an art that one should practice. Robert C. Martin, Uncle Bob, has given a whole chapter on his classic book, Clean Code, a handbook of agile software craftsmanship. So let's explore it. In the chapter Naming Conventions, he has given certain points to remember to keep in mind about naming the things. And the first point is use intention revealing names. It sounds simple, but it's a bit difficult thing to practice. Some people are horrible in naming things, and when they fall in your team, it's nothing sort of a nightmare. So, the idea is that the name of a variable, a function, or a class, or any entity in your program should answer all the big questions. It should tell you why it exists, what it does, and how it is used. If a name requires a comment, then the name does not reveal its intent. Choosing names that reveal intent can make it much easier to understand and change the code. So, how an intention revealing name actually looks like. So for example, here, if we name a variable as only d and then put a comment, elapsed time in days. So, what is much better? The better option is to rather name the variable what its intent is, rather than putting the intention in the comment, which nobody is going to read. It's better to put the intent in the name of the variable. So rather than only naming something as D and then putting the intention after it in the comment section, it's better to name as elapsed time in days, days since creation, days since modification, file age in days, or whatever XYZ your intention is. The second point is avoid disinformation. The point which Robert Martin is trying to make here is that programmers must avoid leaving false clues that obscure the meaning of code. We should avoid words whose entrenched meanings vary from our intended meaning. For example, do not refer to a grouping of student names as a student list unless it is actually a list. The word list means something specific to programmers. If the container holding the names is not actually a list, it may lead to false conclusions. So, a student group or student names would be a better option. Beware of using names which vary in small ways. I mean, how long does it take to spot the subtle difference between XYZ controller for efficient handling of strings in one module and somewhere a little more distant XYZ controller for efficient storage of strings? Only by manipulating or adjusting certain words here and there, we are trying to make a difference. But the difference is so subtle that it's not possible for the people to remember it or to recognize it. So, spelling similar concepts similarly is information, but using inconsistent spellings is disinformation. That's the point which Robert Martin has put here. However, with autocode complete features of IDs that we use these days, it's not a big deal to select a proper name. They sometimes suggest you a name, but still, we must avoid putting a disinformative name. And a big no to lowercase l or uppercase o as variable names, and particularly in their combination, because they almost look like the constant 1 and 0. Now, you may think that who thinks in those terms and who gives such a big thought before naming something? Well, we have seen such confusing, disinformative names causing serious harms. So it's better that any kind of misinformation or disinformation communicating via the names of your variables, your functions, or your class should be avoided. The next point is make meaningful distinctions. So the problem comes when programmers write code solely to satisfy a compiler or an interpreter. Do not make distinctions between the names of two variables or functions only to satisfy the compiler. Make distinctions for the human readers. That means the distinctions should be meaningful. For example, sometimes people name the variables in a number series as A1, A2, A3. Well, this is not disinformative but non informative. The noise words are another meaningless distinction. For example, sometimes we say that a student class, then we make another class called student info, then we build another class, say student data. So this info and data word that we have attached to the entire idea, sometimes they are just the noise because those object does not mean anything different. The next point is use pronunciable names. So the idea is, which Robert Martin is trying to put here, that if you can't pronounce it, you can't discuss it without sounding like an idiot. And if your names are not pronounceable, people will not get open to discuss about them. And why that matters? That matters because programming is a social activity. You're not the only person in your team. You have other teammates with whom you will have to discuss your code. So your name, your names, or the names of your the entity that you are creating, they must be pronounceable as well. So what do we mean by pronounceable name actually? So this is an example. Compare this code with this. What is more pronounceable to you? You name the class as you may have intention as data record something, but you named is DTA RCRD102. And here in the variable names, you put Gen YMDHMS. Maybe you are trying to say that generation, year, month, day, hour, minutes, and seconds, but the people will not pronounce it that way. So, this is not a right way to name something. that you have the intention in your mind and you are putting in certain weird ways and mm, just letting the other people to make clues out of it. It's better to create more pronounceable names like this. The next point is use searchable names. Searching a longer name, let's say max classes per student, is more easy than searching number 7. Searches may turn up the digit as part of the file name, other constant definition, and in various expression, where the value is used with different intent. Similarly, if you will name something as small e, so that's a poor choice because then if you will search it, the search will go too long because E is the most common letter in the language and it will show up in every single text in every single program. So, while naming something, remember that you may need to search it in the future as well. The next point is avoid encodings. Java has no such references of encoding the things, type encoding, because objects in Java are so strongly typed and the editing environments are already so much advanced that they detect a type error long before even you run a compile command. But the encoding things exist in other languages, and programmers used to deal with the encodings of the type or scope information into names. But that is just an extra burden now. So Robert Martin says that we have enough encoding to deal with. So encoding type or scope information into names simply adds an extra burden of deciphering it. It is unnecessary mental burden when trying to solve a problem. And encoded names are also not pronounceable and easy to mistype as well. There are sometimes special cases for encodings even in Java. Some people prefer to prefix interfaces with a capital I, which is nothing but a distraction and an unnecessary noise. Avoid mental mapping as well. Readers shouldn't have to mentally translate your names into other names they already know. So that mental mapping should be avoided. Classes and objects should have noun or noun phrase names like customer, student, account, and so on. Do not put a verb in the class name. A class denotes a noun or a noun phrase. So put a class name by keeping the noun or the noun phrase in mind. Methods names, on the contrary, should have a verb or a verb phrase like delete page, save data, do this, get that, set that, and all that. We already have the accessor and mutator with the get and set prefix. And anyhow, these days, method namings suggestions, class name suggestions generally come from the ID side. So we don't care about that much, but we must keep these points in mind. The next point is don't be cute. If your names are too clever, they will be memorable only to people who share the same sense of humor as you. So don't try to be so clever or cute that I'll put certain name in a certain way and people will laugh out of it. They can laugh out of it, but their laugh or their humor won't help you in your code. So names should be simple and straightforward rather than twisting or turning their meaning. Just be straight. The next point is pick one word per concept. So the idea is that ideally you should have one word for one abstract concept and then you must stick with it. Just name the things in a way that only by reading the name you will get to know that what's the concept behind it. The next point is don't pun. Avoid using the same word for two purposes. Using the same term for two different idea is essentially a pun. So double meaning may sound interesting in real life, but in programming it creates only the mess. Our goal as the author of the code is to make our code as easy as possible to understand. We want our code to be quick, a scheme, not an intense study. We want to allow our readers to quickly scheme out of our code. We don't want to force them to do a deep research on our code or do a deep study on our code. Next point is use solution domain names. Remember that the people who read your code will be the programmers. So you can easily use the computer science terms, the algorithm names, the pattern names, and the math terms, and so on. Do not try to draw every name from the problem domain. But at the same time, he says that use the problem domain names. Separating solution and problem domain concept is part of the job of a good programmer and a designer. The next point is add meaningful context. Well, there are certain names that are meaningful by themselves, and there are certain names which are not. And you cannot all the time make your name meaningful. But what you can do is that you can add a meaningful context in your name. For example, if you have variables, let's say first name, last name, street, house number, city, state, and zip code. So when you read them together, you are quite clear that they form an address. But what if you just saw the state variable being used alone in a method? Will you be able to automatically infer that it is a part of an address? No, you cannot, because a state can have other meanings as well. So, by adding a certain context in those names, we can make our intention more clear. So, let's say we can put add or address first name, address last name, address state, and so on. And finally, the goal of this exercise of writing clean code is to make your code more readable and understandable. And it's an ongoing learning path. A good developer must attempt to pursue. The simpler you are able to project your ideas, the more mature you become as a professional. And in the next part, we will discuss the best practices of clean coding for the functions, the building blocks of our program. We'll try to explore how we can write a small, readable, and simple functions that serve our purpose.